In 1942, a German doctor carefully sterilized his surgical instruments. He then cut open the leg of a healthy young woman, filled the wound with wood splinters, dirt, and glass, and wrote down the results. He called it science. The women who survived called themselves the rabbits. This is the story of what happened when an entire government turned torture into paperwork. It did not start with camps. It started with a law. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. No tanks rolled through the streets. No emergency sirens wailed. The change came through ink on paper. Within months, the government passed laws stripping rights from specific groups. Jewish women lost their jobs as teachers, doctors, and civil servants. Political opponents, communists, socialists, trade unionists, found their meetings raided and their names added to lists. The Nazi system understood something crucial. You do not build a machine of mass torture overnight. You build it brick by legal brick, while people look the other way. By 1935, the Nuremberg laws became official. Jewish women were no longer citizens. That word times, citizen times, mattered more than anyone realized. Without citizenship, there was no legal protection, no right to complain, no right to a trial. The door was now open, and in the shadows, something else was happening. The Gestapo, the secret state police, were given unlimited power to arrest anyone deemed an enemy of the state. No warrants, no explanation, no phone calls. Women began disappearing. Not thousands yet, just a few here and there. A neighbor who spoke against the regime. A shopkeeper who refused to display the flag. A student who handed out leaflets, taken from their homes at 2 a.m. Their families told nothing. The arrests were random enough to terrify everyone, but targeted enough to seem legitimate. Fear spread like a gas leak. Invisible, odorless, deadly. What happened to these women after they were taken remained hidden. There were no journalists asking questions. No international observers demanding answers, just locked doors and brick walls and rumors that nobody wanted to believe. But in 1939, the hidden part of the system became permanent. The Nazis built something new, something designed specifically for women. 90 kilometers north of Berlin, near a quiet lake, surrounded by pine forests, construction began on Ravensbrück concentration camp. The location was deliberate, far enough from the city to be forgotten, close enough to transport prisoners by rail, beautiful enough to seem like nothing terrible could happen there. The first prisoners arrived in May 1939. German women, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses. Women labeled as asocial, a catch-all term for anyone who did not fit the Nazi ideal. Prostitutes, lesbians, homeless women, the nonconformists. At first, the camp looked almost orderly. Barracks lined up in neat rows. A schedule posted on the wall. Roll call at dawn. But the order was a mask. Every morning before sunrise, guards forced thousands of women onto the parade ground. The Germans called it Times Appell. Prisoners stood in rows of 10, perfectly straight, completely silent. Guards counted them, then counted again. A single mistake in the count meant starting over. In winter, temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. Women stood in thin prison uniforms, their breath freezing in the air, their bare feet turning blue against the frozen ground. If a woman collapsed, guards beat her with wooden sticks until she stood back up or stopped moving entirely. Some roll calls lasted 2 hours. Some lasted 6. Some lasted until women died, standing up, held upright, only by the bodies pressed against them. The counting was not about security. It was about control, breaking the human spirit through repetition and exhaustion, and cold so deep it settled into bone. Food was another weapon. The daily ration consisted of watery soup made from rotting vegetables and a slice of bread the size of a fist. Sometimes the bread was mixed with sawdust to stretch the flour. The human stomach cannot digest sawdust. Women ate it anyway because there was nothing else. Within weeks, bodies began changing. Cheekbones sharpened, ribs pushed against skin, menstruation stopped, hair fell out. The body, starved of nutrients, began consuming its own muscle tissue. Starvation did more than weaken the body. It weakened the mind. Malnourished women became confused, forgetful, slow to react, which meant more beatings, more punishment. The system fed itself. Then came the work. The SS signed contracts with German corporations, Siemens, Daimler-Benz, factories that needed labor. Women were marched to assembly lines where they built electrical components and weapons parts, 12-hour shifts, standing the entire time. Foremen watched from platforms, and any woman who slowed down had her number recorded. Punishment happened publicly. A wooden frame stood in the center of the camp. Women were bent over it, their hands and feet tied to posts. Guards beat them with leather whips or wooden rods. 25 lashes, 50, sometimes more. The other prisoners were forced to watch and count each strike aloud. If a woman screamed, the counting started over. But the physical pain was only part of the design. The Nazis understood psychological torture, isolation, humiliation, the destruction of identity. When women arrived at Ravensbrück, their heads were shaved, their clothes were taken, their names were replaced with numbers tattooed on skin or sewn onto uniforms, wedding rings, photographs, letters from children. Everything that marked a person as an individual disappeared into storage rooms that eventually overflowed with human memory. The barracks themselves were designed to strip away any remaining dignity. Hundreds of women crammed into spaces built for 50. No privacy, no quiet. 3 or 4 women shared a single bunk, sleeping pressed together on wooden slats, with no mattresses, no blankets, no heat. Lice spread within days. Typhus followed. Women died in their sleep, and in the morning, their bodies were dragged to the pile outside. The camp doctors walked through the barracks occasionally, not to treat the sick, to select. Once every few weeks, SS doctors walked through the camp carrying clipboards and wearing clean white coats. They moved down the lines of women with calm, bored expressions. A glance, a nod, a name written down. They were choosing who would live and who would die. Women too weak to work. Women with visible injuries. Women whose bodies had simply run out of time. The doctors marked them for what the Nazis called special treatment. In the early years, this meant a bullet to the back of the head or a lethal injection of phenol directly into the heart. The bodies were burned in the camp crematorium, the smoke rising over the pine forest day and night. But killing was expensive. Bullets cost money. Injections required supplies, so the Nazis found cheaper methods. In 1944, a gas chamber was built at Ravensbrück itself, a small brick building near the back wall. Women were told they were going to the showers. They were locked inside, the doors sealed. Zyklon B pellets were dropped through openings in the ceiling. The gas took between 5 and 15 minutes. By the time the Allies liberated the camp, this single gas chamber had killed over 5,000 women in just a few months. The bodies were burned so fast, the crematorium could not keep up. Workers stacked corpses like firewood outside the building, while new groups of women were already being marched toward the doors. But even the gas chamber was not the worst thing waiting inside Ravensbrück. In a separate block, behind heavier security, something entirely different was happening. Something the Nazis were so proud of, they documented every detail with photographs and medical charts and progress reports filed in triplicate. The doctors were about to take over. In 1942, a group of Polish women arrived at Ravensbrück. They were young. Most were university students or members of the resistance before their arrest. They were healthy, strong, educated. These qualities marked them for death. The camp doctors needed test subjects, human bodies they could cut open, infect, and observe. The Polish women were perfect. Their youth meant they would survive longer during procedures. Their strength meant the experiments could be repeated multiple times. The doctors called them times Versuchskaninchen, lab rabbits. The women called themselves the rabbits, a name they reclaimed as an act of defiance. But defiance could not stop what happened next. The experiments were led by doctors like Karl Gebhardt, Heinrich Himmler's personal physician, and Fritz Fischer. They were trained surgeons, published researchers, respected men in the German medical community. Here is what they did. A young woman was brought into the operating room. Sometimes she was given a weak anesthetic. Sometimes nothing at all. The doctors made deep incisions into her legs, cuts that went through skin, muscle, and sometimes down to the bone. Then they introduced infection. They rubbed bacteria into the wounds. Streptococcus, tetanus, gangrene-causing organisms cultured in the camp laboratory. They added foreign materials, wood splinters, dirt, crushed glass, to simulate battlefield injuries. The goal was to test treatments for German soldiers wounded on the Eastern Front, sulfa drugs, antibiotics, surgical techniques. The rabbits were the control group, the data points, the raw material. After the wounds were infected, the doctors did not treat them immediately. They waited. They observed. They took photographs every few hours, documenting the spread of infection, the swelling, the discoloration of tissue as gangrene set in. The pain was constant. Women lay on wooden bunks, their legs swollen to twice normal size, pus, and blood seeping through bandages that were rarely changed. Fevers spiked. Some women became delirious. Others bit through their own lips to keep from screaming. The doctors returned every few days. Sometimes they operated again, cutting out infected tissue, removing sections of muscle, scraping down to bone. Sometimes they amputated. Sometimes they simply noted the progress of the infection in their charts and moved on to the next patient. At least 5 women died from the experiments. Many more were left permanently disabled. Some could not walk. Some had chronic pain for the rest of their lives. Some had bones so damaged their legs, never healed properly. The rabbits knew they were being killed slowly. They also knew the doctors had families, children, homes they returned to at night after spending the day cutting into unanesthetized women. This knowledge was a different kind of torture, but the doctors were not finished. The leg experiments were only one project. Across the camp, other medical teams were working on something the Nazi leadership considered even more important: the elimination of entire races. The Nazi obsession with racial purity extended to reproduction. They wanted certain groups to stop having children permanently: Jews, Romani people, Slavs, the disabled, anyone whose bloodline the regime considered contaminated. Mass sterilization was the solution, but it had to be efficient. Surgical sterilization took too long and required too many resources. The doctors needed a method that could sterilize thousands of women without slowing down. Ravensbrück and Auschwitz became testing centers. Women were brought into rooms and positioned under machines that delivered high doses of radiation aimed at their reproductive organs. The radiation burned through skin and tissue to destroy ovaries. Women experienced immediate pain, then blistering burns, then nausea and vomiting as radiation sickness set in. Many died within weeks from organ failure. Those who survived were cut open later so doctors could examine the damage and determine if the sterilization was complete. These follow-up surgeries were performed without anesthesia because the doctors considered the women disposable. Other experiments involved chemical injections directly into the uterus. The chemicals caused intense cramping, bleeding, and often fatal infections. The women screamed and writhed on tables while doctors watched, clipboards in hand, timing how long the reaction lasted. At Auschwitz, the experiments expanded further. Josef Mengele, the angel of death, had particular interest in women's reproductive systems. He wanted to understand how to breed the perfect Aryan and how to prevent the unfit from breeding at all. Pregnant women who arrived at Auschwitz were usually sent immediately to the gas chambers, but Mengele sometimes pulled them aside. He wanted to study pregnancy under starvation conditions. He wanted to see what happened to the fetus when the mother was denied food and subjected to extreme cold. After the women gave birth, Mengele often killed the newborns himself, an injection to the heart, a blow to the skull, so he could dissect the bodies and compare them to his theories. He took notes the entire time. Neat handwriting, proper medical terminology. The dissonance between the clinical documentation and the reality of what was happening is difficult to process. These were not torturers working in secret dungeons. These were respected doctors writing research papers and attending medical conferences and receiving funding from the German government. The bureaucracy of torture made it invisible. But there is another category of suffering that the official records barely mention. The Nazis did not document it because they did not consider it a crime. The survivors did. In 1942, the SS authorized the creation of camp brothels. 10 camps received them, including Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. The system worked like this. Women were selected from the general prisoner population, usually younger women, often those who had recently arrived and were still relatively healthy. They were told they were being transferred to lighter work, perhaps kitchen duty or laundry. Instead, they were brought to special barracks, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by female overseers. The doors locked behind them. Inside, small rooms lined a corridor. Each room contained a bed and nothing else. A peephole in the door allowed guards to monitor everything. Male prisoners, mostly non-Jewish criminal inmates who the SS favored, were given tickets to visit the brothel as a reward for good behavior. They lined up outside. They were given exactly 15 minutes. The guards timed it. The women had no choice. Refusal meant execution or transfer to the punishment block. Some tried to resist and were beaten until they complied. Others were too starved and broken to resist at all. The brothels were not secret. The SS administration tracked them with the same bureaucratic precision as everything else. There were schedules, quotas, reports on efficiency. The women inside were given slightly more food than other prisoners, enough to keep them functional, but not enough to restore their health. They received no medical care for the diseases and injuries that inevitably followed. When a woman became too sick or too weak to continue, she was sent back to the general population. Many did not survive the return. The brothel system operated until the final months of the war. When the camps were liberated, these barracks were often among the first buildings the SS destroyed in an attempt to hide the evidence. But the physical destruction of buildings could not erase what happened inside them. The women who survived carried the memory. Some would never speak of it. Some are still speaking now. Not all victims arrived at the camps randomly. Some were specifically targeted because they had fought back. Across occupied Europe, women played essential roles in resistance networks. They carried messages sewn into the hems of their dresses. They hid downed Allied pilots in their attics. They smuggled weapons in baby carriages. They poisoned German officers at dinner parties. They blew up railway lines under cover of darkness. The Gestapo hunted them relentlessly. When a resistance woman was captured, she was not sent immediately to a camp. First, she was taken to an interrogation center. These centers operated in cities across occupied territory. Paris had one, Warsaw had several, Prague, Amsterdam. Ordinary buildings from the outside, soundproofed rooms on the inside. The interrogators used a specific methodology designed to break someone as quickly as possible. It began with isolation. The woman was placed in a cell with no windows, no light, no sound except her own breathing. Days passed. The isolation disoriented her. Time lost meaning. When the interrogator finally appeared, the sudden human contact felt overwhelming, a calculated psychological manipulation. Then the questioning began. The interrogator wanted names, contacts, safe house locations, supply routes. The woman knew that giving up this information meant the deaths of her comrades. She also knew that refusing meant what came next. Beatings were the baseline. Fists, boots, wooden batons. Guards struck the face, the stomach, the kidneys, areas where the damage was painful, but not immediately fatal. When beatings did not work, the interrogators escalated. Electric shocks were common. Wires were attached to sensitive parts of the body, nipples, genitals, the inside of the mouth, and current was applied in pulses. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, causing muscles to contract so violently that bones sometimes broke. Water torture was used frequently. The woman was strapped to a table, and a cloth was placed over her face. Water was poured onto the cloth, creating the sensation of drowning. The body's panic response kicked in the desperate, primal terror of being unable to breathe. The interrogator would stop, ask the question again, then start again. Some women were hung by their arms, wrists tied behind their backs, and then lifted off the ground. This method, known as times strappado, times dislocated shoulders and tore ligaments, permanent nerve damage was guaranteed after enough sessions. Fingernails were pulled out with pliers. Bones in fingers and toes were broken one by one. Cigarettes were pressed into skin and held there. Through all of this, the interrogators took notes. They recorded what the women said and what they did not say. The files were typed up and filed. The bureaucracy absorbed everything. Most women eventually broke. Human bodies and minds have limits. What varied was how long they held out. Some lasted hours, some lasted days, some lasted weeks. When the interrogators had extracted everything they could, or when the woman was too damaged to provide more information, the final decision was made. Some were executed on the spot. A bullet in the back of the neck in a courtyard behind the building. The body was burned or buried in an unmarked grave. Others were loaded onto trains. The trains that carried women to the camps were not passenger trains. They were cattle cars, wooden boxes on wheels, designed to transport livestock. SS officers supervised the loading. 100 women or more were packed into a single car designed for 40 animals. The doors were slid shut and bolted from the outside. There were no windows, no toilets, no food, no water. The journeys sometimes lasted days. In summer, the heat inside the cars became suffocating. Women stripped off what clothing they had, gasping for air in the darkness. The smell of sweat and urine and fear filled the car. People vomited from the motion of the train and the stench. The vomit mixed with the filth on the floor. In winter, the cars became freezers. Women huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the darkness, their fingers and toes going numb. Some fell asleep and did not wake up. Their bodies remained standing because there was no room to fall. The dead and the living traveled together. When the train finally stopped, the doors slid open to blinding light and shouting guards and barking dogs. Women stumbled out, disoriented, barely able to walk. They had arrived at the camp, but the suffering of transport had created a crucial effect. By the time women reached the gates, they were already broken, already weakened, already stripped of the will to resist. The Nazis had designed it this way. Transport was not just logistics. It was the first stage of camp processing. The women who stepped off those trains were already less human than the women who had been forced onto them. The guards at the gates saw this. They were about to make things much worse. The image most people have of Nazi guards is male. SS officers in black uniforms. Brutal men with skull insignias. But at Ravensbrück and other women's camps, many of the most feared guards were women. The SS recruited female guards called times Aufseherinnen, times from the general population. Some were true believers in Nazi ideology. Others wanted steady pay and authority. A few seemed to genuinely enjoy the work. They were trained at Ravensbrück itself. The training emphasized one principle. Prisoners were not human. Sympathy was weakness. Violence was the correct response to any disobedience. Once trained, the guards were assigned to oversee work details, supervise barracks, and maintain order during roll calls. Dorothea Binz was one of the most notorious. She started as a kitchen worker and rose to become the head female guard at Ravensbrück. Survivors described her as calm and methodical. She did not scream, or lose control. She simply hurt people with the detached efficiency of someone completing a routine task. Binz carried a whip with her, always. She used it for any infraction: a woman not working fast enough, a woman looking in the wrong direction, a woman whose uniform was not perfectly arranged. The whip left deep cuts that often became infected. She also had a dog. A German shepherd trained to attack on command. Binz would walk through the camp with the dog at her side, and sometimes, without warning, point at a prisoner. The dog would launch itself at the woman, teeth sinking into flesh, dragging her to the ground while Binz watched. The randomness was the point. Any woman could be next. The uncertainty itself was torture. Irma Grese was even younger. 19 years old when she began working at Ravensbrück, later transferred to Auschwitz and then Bergen-Belsen. She was known for her physical beauty, blonde hair, blue eyes, the exact Aryan ideal the regime promoted. She was also a sadist. Grese carried a pistol and a whip made of plaited cellophane. She beat women until they were unrecognizable. She set her dogs on starving prisoners for sport. She personally selected women for the gas chambers, sometimes choosing based on nothing more than a glance. Prisoners whispered about her in the barracks. They said she smiled when she hurt people. The female guards presented a particular horror. Women, brutalizing other women, shattered any illusion of shared experience or potential mercy. The guards were proof that cruelty was not a male trait, but a human one. And in the final months of the war, as the camp system began collapsing, the guards became even more dangerous. They knew the end was coming. They knew they might face consequences for what they had done. They stopped pretending there were rules at all. By late 1944, the war was lost. Allied bombers flew over Germany day and night. Soviet forces pushed in from the east, advancing through Poland toward Berlin. American and British forces moved in from the west after the D-Day landings in Normandy. The Nazi leadership knew the camps would be discovered. They knew the evidence of their crimes was massive and undeniable. They decided to destroy it. Prisoners were forced to dig up mass graves and burn the bodies. Records were pulled from filing cabinets and set on fire. Buildings were dynamited. But the evidence that mattered most was the living witnesses. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners still occupied camps across Germany and occupied territory. The Nazis decided to move them. In January 1945, as Soviet forces approached Auschwitz, the SS began evacuating the camp. 60,000 prisoners were marched out through the snow toward destinations deeper inside Germany. Women who had been starving for years were now forced to walk. The temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. Snow piled up along the roads. Wind cut through the thin prison uniforms. The SS guards set the pace. Anyone who fell behind was shot where she dropped. The gunshots became so frequent that prisoners stopped flinching. Women collapsed from exhaustion and were left in the snow. Some tried to crawl and were shot. Some simply sat down and waited for the bullet, too tired to take another step. The column left a trail of bodies stretching for miles. At night, the guards herded prisoners into barns or open fields. There was no shelter, no food. Some women ate snow to stay hydrated. Others ate grass or bark or nothing at all. In the morning, the bodies of those who died overnight were kicked aside, and the march continued. From Ravensbrück, similar marches began in April 1945. Thousands of women were forced onto the roads, heading nowhere in particular, driven forward by guards who were increasingly desperate and increasingly violent. The marches killed more prisoners in 3 months than the previous 3 years of camp operations. Precise numbers are impossible to know. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves, burned in piles, or simply abandoned in ditches and forests. Some women survived because they escaped. When the guards were distracted, or when bombing raids caused chaos, prisoners ran into the woods, or hid in barns, or pretended to be dead until the column moved on. Others survived, because the marches were intercepted. Soviet and American units, advancing faster than the Germans expected, came across columns of skeletal women staggering along roads. The soldiers had heard rumors about the camps. Now they saw the proof with their own eyes. What they found inside the camps themselves was even worse. In January 1945, Soviet troops entered Auschwitz. They found 7,000 prisoners still alive, those too sick or weak to be marched out. Piles of corpses everywhere. Warehouses filled with human hair, shoes, eyeglasses, and artificial limbs. The soldiers, hardened by years of brutal combat, wept. In April 1945, Soviet forces reached Ravensbrück. The SS had fled days earlier, taking many prisoners on death marches and shooting those who could not walk. About 2,000 sick and dying women remained. The liberators found women weighing less than 30 kilograms, bodies that were skeleton and skin, eyes that had seen too much to ever close peacefully again. They found the punishment block, the gas chamber, the medical experiment rooms with surgical instruments still laid out on trays. They found the records the SS had not managed to burn. Names, dates, procedures, clinical descriptions of what had been done and to whom. The documentation would later be used in trials. But liberation was not the end of suffering. Many women died in the weeks after being freed. Their bodies, pushed past every limit, simply could not recover. They died in hospital beds, with clean sheets and real food. They were too weak to digest. The survivors faced a different kind of aftermath. Most had no homes to return to. Their families had been murdered. Their cities had been bombed. Their communities no longer existed. Their bodies carried permanent damage, scars from beatings, limbs that would not work properly, internal injuries from starvation and abuse, chronic pain that would last until death. And then there were the invisible wounds, nightmares that came every night, sounds that triggered panic attacks, the inability to trust, the inability to feel safe, the knowledge, impossible to forget, of what human beings are capable of doing to one another. Some survivors spoke about what happened. They testified at trials, they wrote books, they gave interviews to historians who were trying to understand. Others stayed silent forever. In November 1945, the Nuremberg trials began. 24 high-ranking Nazi officials were tried before an international military tribunal. 12 were sentenced to death. Others received prison terms. But the trials did not end there. Separate proceedings targeted the people who had run the camps and conducted the experiments. The doctors' trial began in December 1946. 23 physicians and medical administrators faced charges for their roles in human experimentation. Karl Gebhardt, the doctor who supervised the Ravensbrück experiments, was among them. The evidence presented was devastating. Photographs, medical records, survivor testimony. The women who had been operated on without anesthesia described in calm, factual detail what had been done to them. Gebhardt was found guilty and hanged in June 1948. The Ravensbrück trials followed. Camp personnel, men and women, were brought before military courts. Dorothea Binz, the guard with the whip and the dog, showed no remorse. She was convicted of war crimes and executed by hanging in May 1947. Irma Grese, the young blonde guard, was tried by a British military court after her capture at Bergen-Belsen. Witnesses described her beating women to death and shooting prisoners for minor infractions. She was found guilty and hanged in December 1945. She was 22 years old, but many perpetrators escaped justice. Some fled to South America with the help of networks that smuggled former Nazis out of Europe. Some changed their names and disappeared into ordinary life in Germany and Austria. Some were never identified because the witnesses who could identify them had been killed. The trials were important. They established that individuals could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. The legal precedents set at Nuremberg still shape international law today. But no courtroom could undo what had happened. The women who survived carried the camps inside them for the rest of their lives. The experiments, The starvation, the violence, the humiliation, the loss of everyone they had loved. And one question remained. The trials answered who gave the orders. They answered who performed the experiments. They answered who pulled the triggers and locked the doors and dropped the gas pellets through the ceiling. But they never fully answered the deeper question. How did ordinary people, doctors, nurses, guards, administrators, neighbors, become part of a machine that tortured and murdered millions? The Nazi system lasted 12 years. In 12 years, a modern, educated, scientifically advanced nation built a bureaucracy of suffering that has no parallel in human history. And it did not start with gas chambers. It started with a law, then another, then a knock on the door in the middle of the night. The women who survived understood something most people do not want to face. The machinery of torture is not built by monsters alone. It is built by ordinary people who accept, step by step, that some lives matter less than others. Once that idea takes hold, everything else follows. The records have been opened. The testimony has been gathered. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. But the question of how it happened and whether it could happen again remains unanswered. And somewhere, in archives that have not yet been fully explored, there are still files waiting to be read.